Variety is the spice of life, most people like to say, and in games, it makes up their essence. Usually, variety in the gameplay prevents repetition from setting in and keeps the player engaged throughout the playthrough. However, Ueda took a much different approach when developing both Eco and Shadow of the Colossus. Instead of trying to fill the game with content, he went in a more minimalistic direction, essentially only making use of its core elements to carry the game. In fact, two of the main factors that Ueda wanted to emphasize with his projects was that he wanted the player's imagination to run wild and wanted them to focus on their own interpretation. And through the simplicity of making a bare-bones game, he intended to accomplish just that. Of course, of the two games, we're here to talk about Shadow of the Colossus, which is the one that seems to have stood the test of time in the eyes of many, being considered one of the best games of 2005. However, at this point in the year of 2024, Shadow of the Colossus is at least 19 years old. With other titles like Journey and Flower having similar minimalistic elements, is Shadow of the Colossus still deserving of that recognition of being one of the best games of the 6th generation? Well, even with some glaring issues, I'd argue yes, and I'm about to explain why. So the area where people generally agree the game succeeds in is the story. The game opens with an introduction to the Forbidden Lands. The narration uses a lot of vague descriptions, such as it being a land of intersecting points, and it was a place where the dead can come back to life, but one must never set foot within it. Cut to the shrine of worship, and we see Wander laying a dead girl named Mono on a pedestal. We don't know what his relationship to her was, whether she was a sister, wife, or cousin to him. All we know is that he wants to bring her back to life, for she was sacrificed for an unnecessary cause. Making a deal with the spirit Dormin, Wander must set out on a quest to slay 16 Colossi in order to bring back Mono. However, by doing this, he pays a steep price. Basically, from then on out, Wander destroys a Colossus, is sent back to the Shrine of Worship, and is tasked with destroying another one by Dormin in the same repetitive fashion. Yet, despite the rather simplistic nature, the narrative still manages to be ripe with character and subtlety. First of all, there's the relatability of Wander himself. It's pretty clear that throughout the game, Wander isn't really the best warrior. While being a solid equestrian and skilled with the bow may make it seem as if he has the trappings of a knight, the game is quick to show he's far from one. The ending reveals that he stole the sword, and when he tries to fight in combat, his blows are slow and clumsy. However, despite clearly being one of the commons folks, his perseverance is admirable. The wiki describes that although not the best warrior, he is determined to save Mono at any cost and will stop at nothing to defeat the Colossi that stand between him and Mono's resurrection. Perhaps it's this determination that is his biggest flaw, for at the end of the game, while he resurrects Mono, he also gets his body possessed by Dormin. This establishes the relatable human aspect of him. He pushed past his boundaries to get something that he really wanted, and in the end, he inevitably destroyed himself for a dream, for his mortality could only take so much of it. Maybe that's not what Ueda intended, and I'm looking into it too much with a Western lens, but as Todd from BoJack Horseman said,
"But isn't the point of art less what people put into it, and more what people get out of it?"
Which brings me to the more ambiguous aspect of the story, that being the Colossi. Now, I like to think of them as similar to Hobbes from Calvin and Hobbes. Bill Watterson basically just left it up to the reader to decide whether Hobbes was an actual entity or just from Calvin's imagination, and the same could be said for the mortality of the Colossi. Some like to argue that the Colossi are living beings, and in the West, fans like to assign them names. But the game is very specific that the Colossi are simply cut up parts of Dormin separated into 16 bodies, which disproves the idea they have a conscience. However, at the same time, defeating a Colossus seems to represent a somber moment. The music that plays after you kill one seems to indicate the sadness of a loss of life. Then again, that could be open to a lot of interpretation. The sad music could be representing how Wander is taking a step closer to becoming a host for Dormin. And speaking of Dormin, it's not clear if he really serves the role as the primary antagonist. A lot of this stems from the fact that it's never quite explained as to why he was exiled in the first place. It might have something to do with his ability to raise people from the dead, but we don't know for sure. In fact, Lord Eamon might fit the role of the villain archetype much better considering how he seems to be the establishment that enforces all the rules in an attempt to stymie Wander's free will. Now, of course, this is very relative, and it's true that Dorman is the one that does possess Wander's body. However, at the same time, Dorman still keeps his word with resurrecting Mono, and he does warn Wander in the beginning that there was going to be a high price to pay with what he was about to do. And don't give me that crap that Dorman looks evil because of the horns on his head. For God's sake, the boy in Eco had horns on his head. How prejudiced can you be? But as you can see, considering how minimalistic the story is, Shadow of the Colossus has a lot of mystery to the narrative. It's not like Birth by Sleep where questions left plot holes. Ueda seems to have intentionally left things vague so that the player could fill them in. If you think that Wander was stupid for following Dorman and Lord Eamon was right, then that's just as reasonable as thinking the opposite. That's basically the beauty behind the minimalism in the game. Because it's so bare bones, it can literally mean anything to different people. As juvenile as this example may be, the hokey pokey can have a myriad of meanings. When talking about turning yourself around, the songwriter could have simply meant to turn around physically or to practically do a self-evaluation on your own life. Such ambiguity is kind of what Shadow of the Colossus was striving for, and the barrenness of the Forbidden Lands also brings about Ueda's expertise in minimalism. The entire area is empty, with the only signs of life being the geckos that slither across the save points and a handful of turtles that walk across the desert plains. Some people might think that this makes Shadow of the Colossus boring, and to a certain extent it does, although, at the same time, it brings a sense of loneliness. And that's cathartic in its own way. It's not too easy having to live life with the hustle of a capitalist society, so being able to sit down with this game and ride around with aggro was relaxing. It's the equivalent of walking through a forest, which I often do when depressed. If you think about it, if the Forbidden Lands had more collectibles, then it would have just been unnecessary baggage. It would have taken away from that isolating atmosphere. And while there might not be much life in the Forbidden Lands, there are signs that there may have been some semblance of it, like the little arches you see in the desert may indicate there once was a civilization, but even this conveys the loneliness of Wander's journey. In fact, standing on one of the save points causes the camera to zoom out, almost as if to convey how Wander is just a tiny speck in a vast world. The only company he'll ever have in his quest is aggro, and Ueda went through the liberty of making her feel like an actual horse. She sometimes won't listen to him when he calls the first couple of times. This works because it makes aggro feel like a living being. Sometimes when you're near a pond of water, she'll take a drink. When you aim an arrow at her, she runs away. She's a living, breathing horse to keep you company during the journey. But then as a gameplay mechanic, if I were to be honest, she's not very refined. Not only does she not listen, but riding her can feel a bit janky at times. Whenever you accidentally run into a structure or rock formation, aggro will reel back in dismay, which slows down the traversal. So, thematically, she works very well, but mechanically, not so much. And you can sort of say something similar regarding the way the fruit and lizards were implemented. I know I said that extra collectibles ruined the minimalistic nature of the game, so maybe that's why there wasn't much thought put into it. Still, there were some issues that these had, namely how there could have been at least some effort put into these to make them more interesting. There is a pear of fruit that overhangs a cliff. Once you shoot it down, you have to find a way to get to the bottom. I wish there were more instances like that because most of the time, the trees are hanging in plain sight. The issue with the lizards is the complete opposite, because they tend to be more elusive. I initially thought they were only at save points, however, I came to realize these motherfuckers were all over the map. The laser detector was hard to use because the displayed icon wasn't always accurate. Sometimes I'd position myself right on where I thought the lizard should be, and I'd get nothing, so this would often leave me running around in this particular spot until it finally popped up. At least the fruits and lizards reward you with more stamina and health, which was a necessity to survive some of the Colossi battles, as well as getting to the secret garden, which can take quite a few playthroughs to get up there. But since there was often no challenge involved with collecting these, they often were pace killers. Having to painstakingly spend time attempting to shoot a lizard or climb up and down a tree to shoot some fruit isn't very fun. For the sake of making a cinematic platformer, the mechanics more or less were sacrificed for the aesthetics of the atmosphere. Such a sentiment can be reiterated with the Colossi. Basically, they all require Wander to climb onto them and subdue its weak point. The interesting aspect is that each of them force you to utilize a different method to perform this depending on their design. For instance, the third Colossus, Gaius, has armor that prevents it from being climbed on. Therefore, in order to beat it, you have to find a way to break through it. I always thought that after he slammed his sword enough, his armor just breaks on his own. However, when I was doing the time trial, I realized there was a stone circle in the middle of the arena. Basically, the Colossus had to strike its sword on that surface for its shoulder plate to break. And then you have others like Basaron, otherwise known as Colossus 9. Basically, you can't get on top of him unless you knock him over with one of the geysers. When I first confronted Basaron, it took me ages to figure out how to knock him over. Even with the hint that the earth will shake the Colossus, it wasn't particularly clear. The hot springs looked very suspicious. So, after a long time of just running around, dodging its laser blasts with aggro, I finally managed to lead Basaron to one of them to have it slip on its feet. It's this kind of stuff where Shadow of the Colossus really challenges the astute player. While every Colossi has the same idea of stabbing its weak point, some of them force you to pay attention to your surroundings to earn your victory. There are even a handful of Colossi that aren't much in terms of size, and with these the game really changes the formula. The 8th Colossus, Koromori, is a medium-sized lizard that scales across the walls. To fight it, you have to stay within a stone structure and shoot arrows at it through a small window. You constantly have to go up and down the stairs in order to get a clear shot at its weak points, making this one of the few Colossi where you don't have to climb on its fur-coated arms or legs. Because of this, it freshens up the boss fight, making it feel distinguishable from the others. Plus, it has you using arrows along with your sword, so it has you utilizing your full arsenal. But the 11th Colossus, Sosia, is the most interesting one because of how it makes you take advantage of a specific personality trait it has, that being fear. Usually the best emotion the Colossi express is the discomfort of being climbed on. They tend to flinch and swing about. This all changes with Sosia. You literally have to scare him into walking too many steps backwards so that he eventually falls on his back, which shatters the seal locking away his sigil. The fact you have to take advantage of this trait differentiates him from the others because the Colossi were never hinted at being afraid of much of anything. While there were some where you had to exploit an environmental factor, there was never one where you had to take advantage of a particular emotion. There was no indication that they felt happiness, sadness, anger, or resentment, up until you fight Sosia. So as you can see, while the concept is the same for fighting the Colossi, the execution is very unique. It not only adds some variety to the gameplay, but it also provides a sense of satisfaction to beating each one. Figuring out the process to reach the Colossi sigil truly makes each fight feel more like a puzzle that needs to be solved, rather than a job I need to fulfill. Of course, this sort of gets ruined by the fact that the game inadvertently drops a hint your way if you appear to be stuck. This type of hand-holding kind of takes away the fun of learning each Colossus's pattern on your own. However, the hint system is a minor issue compared to the awkward collision detection when climbing on a Colossus's back. Let's just say that trying to land a single sword jab isn't the easiest thing to pull off. Wander is just so sensitive to when the Colossus shakes. Every time he raises his sword as if to unleash a powerful stab, he gets disrupted by the shaking head of the giant, which causes him to lose his grip for some time. In my first playthrough, I usually waited for some time to have them stop swiveling around. But in my second playthrough, I learned that if you remain in the center of the sigil, then Wander will be less likely to fidget with the Colossus. Of course, this is easier said than done, considering that Wander sometimes won't budge if his opponent is squirming too much. To quote Sena Hossein of Forever Classic Games, Shadow of the Colossus leaned more heavily into being a cinematic platformer, rather than a more skill-based title. and the issues of including luck-based elements in both movement and combat were accentuated into time attack mode. Let's take Gaius as an example. Considering the time attack starts you off with the base stamina, you won't have a lot of energy to climb up its arm, but in order to even get to that, as mentioned before, you have to destroy its armor. However, since this is timed, there's a lot more stress involved. Getting him to hit the circle eats up quite a few minutes that otherwise could have been used climbing up to his weak point. And I know there are different exploits like the sword jump that don't require to break the barrier, but no thanks. I don't have the time to master something like that. To add to the frustration, you have barely enough stamina to remain on its head, much less his stomach. In fact, just trying to cling onto its belly really makes me want to gouge out my eyes because of how hard it was. Thankfully, the time attacks were rewarding. For completing a certain amount of them would usually net you with different rewards. Some of these, like the Mask of Power and a Cloak of Force, were useful since they allowed you to kill some of the Colossi in one hit. It's sad to say that the process of getting to these wasn't as satisfying. As a side note, I looked up if the PS3 version was better than the PS2, and I learned that Wander struggling with the collision detection was to compensate for the PS2's version's frame drops. Of course, while the frame rate improved when it was remastered for the PS3, the general stiffness with the climbing did not. I think it's because of this that Wander tends to flail a lot more when on a Colossus and a remaster. That being said, I've yet to actually play the PS2 original or PS4 remake, so don't take my word for it. Of course, this was a rather minor issue compared to the grand scheme of the game, and overall, there was enough differentiation of the boss fights that it never truly became tedious. And I can say the same for the art and music direction. Each of the Colossi are very uniquely crafted. They all have different bodily characteristics that fit the environments they're placed in. Considering that Dirges fought in a sandy, secluded cave, you'd think Team Ico would give him certain features to reflect that mystique. Therefore, he has the body of a worm that allows him to tunnel underneath the sandy surface, which shows his more elusive nature. For Argus, since you fight him inside of a Colosseum, his design looks like a giant gladiator, as seen with the immense cleaver, which was common for fighters at the time. However, the final Colossus, Malus, really stands out in this area. He's literally a walking city. Add to it the thunderstorm in the background, and this boss is the embodiment of a dystopian future society. The chanting of Hallelujah to supplement the ominous music really provides that sense of moving towards your doom. In fact, just before this, Agro had sacrificed herself for Wander, which accentuates the stakes that he cannot fail on this final task. And speaking of the music, Shadow of the Colossus excels in this field as well. Something as insignificant as the wind blowing in the background adds to the lonely feeling of Forbidden Lands give. But the way they depict the Colossus battles is where it shines. It's almost like the entire fight is telling a story. Initially, when first encountering a Colossi, the music track is rife with trumpets and percussion as if to describe the immensity of the foe Wander is facing. It can be fast-paced to describe a more frantic battle, but at the same time it can be serene and even relaxing, as if to describe the gracefulness of flying Colossus like Avion and Phalanx. However, when you finally manage to get on top of it, the music will suddenly turn into a chorus of levity, sounding like a victory march. Such change ultimately represents how close Wander is to winning the battle. Then it later switches to a more somber tone when all is said and done, almost as if to demonstrate the general emptiness of your victory. For all it really symbolizes as is one step closer to Wander being fully possessed by Dormin. It all comes together to tell the tragedy that is the centerpiece of Shadow of the Colossus' narrative, and this subtlety really shows the ingenuity of Ueda himself. But does the mastery of this aesthetic save Shadow of the Colossus from its poor mechanics? As isolating and atmospheric as the Forbidden Lands were, they could slow down the pacing of the game. For as epic as it was climbing up each of the Colossi, it also suffered from poor collision detection. Don't get me wrong, Shadow of the Colossus isn't a bad game, it's just one that probably appeals to a specific type of audience. However, all that being said, if you couldn't already tell, there are more areas where this game succeeds than fails. Each of the boss fights against the Colossi provide a different experience, which prevented them from feeling like they were getting stale. Maybe Agro's controls felt too sensitive when brushing against walls, and it was frustrating when she didn't listen, However, such features and characteristics made her feel like she was the only other friend accompanying Wander in this isolating journey, so that when she finally died, it actually meant something. Overall, as long as you're not chasing after those time attacks, you're bound to have a fulfilling experience. So yes, as simple of a concept as Shadow of the Colossus was, it actually still manages to work to this day, thus showing that minimalistic games, as bare bones as they might be, still provide fulfillment in their own unique style. Well, that's about it. Thank you for the 4 people who are probably going to watch this. I certainly don't expect this video to succeed. Personally, I'm not very happy with it, but still, thank you for tuning in. I'm Dave Reviews, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time.